Hello there, adventurers, and welcome to Wally DM. Today is part 2 of our Player's Survival Guide to Traps. And once again, joining me from How to D&D's YouTube channel is Fred Wheeler. Thanks again for joining us, Fred.
You're welcome, Wally. I'm going to enjoy discussing the topic.
Fantastic. So what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss evaluating traps. And Fred has an entire list for us that's going to help you as a player make sure that your character survives all of the traps your DM has laid out for you and have your DM scratching their head like, what am I doing wrong? It's going to be this guy here. This is going to be Fred's fault because he's going to give you all the tips and tricks you need.
So you've found that trap. You've made your perception check, or you've spotted your trap. You've seen the tripwire, you've noticed the pressure plate or the hole in the wall or the beam of light that can be triggered. And now it's time to decide what you do next. And it's about evaluating the trap to figure out how to deal with it. That's your next step. My suggestion to you is expect your dungeon master to ask for an investigation check. And for that investigation check, probably not to be that high, probably not as high or as difficult to make as a perception check. Now, when you're dealing with something like Wizards of the Coast and their pre-made adventures, they tend to set their DCs quite low. They'll be like a 10, 15, or something in between. So that's not a big deal. So if you're playing an Adventurers League, it's not a hard thing to do. One of the things you might find when you are making your investigation check is if you are very specific about where you look and what you're looking for based on the descriptions your Dungeon Master are giving, you may not have to make a check at all. It is possible that a Dungeon Master might decide that no dice roll is required and that it's pretty obvious once you've spotted the trap how this trap works.
So kind of like if you do open this door, then this poison gas is going to shoot out and you can just like see the mechanism there or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So another aspect, just like perception checks, is be specific about what you're looking for and how you're looking for it and how you're trying to figure it out when you're inspecting a trap. Because you're not going to see the entire thing. You're only going to see part of it. You might see part of the trigger. You might only see just what's on the outside rather than what's on the inside. But if you're specific, that really helps cut down the kind of errors that can occur, particularly since the Dungeon Master doesn't want to reveal anything that you can't actually see, hear, smell, or touch. And of course, we don't want to touch traps or any kind of trigger because it'll probably set it off.
Right. So I'm kind of envisioning traps like a landmine where there's just like this one like thin rod that's sticking out of the ground, but the landmine itself is buried under the ground where you can't see it. And that's basically your traps.
So when you're working through your skills and how to figure out how a trap works, if you're dealing with a magical trap, you may be able to use Arcana, the Arcana skill, to actually assess how that magical trap works. Your Dungeon Master might allow that. It's even possible, based on, say, the nature of the trap being quite common, that you could make a history check. So certainly look at those sorts of options. Now, how would you word that? And you'd say, okay, can I use my knowledge of magic and Arcana to determine the nature of this magical trap that I have detected? Or is there historically a trap that's kind of like that? And they're probably going to ask you to make a dice roll, or if you're proficient, you may have a Dungeon Master who says, no, you're proficient, you know this sort of thing, you don't need to make a dice roll.
I like how you worded that. Instead of just asking your Dungeon Master, can I make an Arcana check? You actually put it more into a hinting towards, may I make an Arcana check? Is there something maybe I've searched or learned from books from school or something that would maybe lead me to knowing what this magical thing is? I really like that as far as being a player, instead of just asking to do a skill check, that you word it in a way that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly, because that's what Dungeon Masters are looking for. They're looking for you to move beyond just the meta game and into the I'm immersed, and as a player, I am looking to figure out how this works.
Yes.
Because usually Dungeon Masters go to a lot of trouble to put traps in their game, if they have any at all. So there's a spell called Identify, and it's very tempting to use Identify to figure out how a magical trap works. But one of the worst things you can do is use the spell, because it requires you to touch the location where the spell effect is. And that usually means it's going to get triggered. So the best way to do this is at a long distance away and cast the spell through your familiar. goodbye to familiar, but you have figured out how that particular spell works. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, now I've triggered the spell, but some magical spells reset. So it's better to lose the familiar, figure out how it works, just in case your dungeon master has made sure this trap resets every time it's activated.
As a dungeon master, I'd be like, great, they have 1 out of 8 that I've planted there. They got the first one. There's 7 more to go. No more familiars.
So some traps are a combination of mechanical and magical, and they are by far the worst types of traps to figure out and try to evaluate how they work, because there's so many working parts, so many aspects to it. So when you deal with a trap like that and you're trying to evaluate it and how to deal with a trap like that, sometimes it's better not to try and evaluate the trap because it's too dangerous, and to simply trigger the trap at a distance and avoid any kind of disarming process, because there's too many things going on. If you are unsure how a trap works, trigger it at a distance.
I like that. That is definitely #1 in my book as far as survival guide. I'm staying way back, and whoever is staying way back to try to trigger it, I'm staying way back from them. I don't want anything to do with that.
So not all traps that are really complicated, that have mechanical and magical aspects, do you want to sort of just trigger because you can't figure out how it works. Sometimes it's better to, okay, I know there's a trap there. I don't know how it works. I don't want to go to the through the process of figuring out how it works. I'm just going to avoid it. If you can go around it or avoid it in some way, then sometimes that's better than trying to trigger the trap, because there are dungeon masters who like to make trap rooms. And since I've done a video on how to make and design trap rooms, you standing 30 feet back may not be far enough. You may find that you have to be quite a lot further back than that to avoid it triggering. And if it's one of those rolling boulder things, it won't matter how far you are back, because it's going to follow a trail all the way to where you are standing like 100 feet away, because it's got a path or a ridge marked into the floor. So it follows it right to your destination.
Now, what an evil dungeon master would do, Fred, is anyone within 3 to 5 feet of that trap is safe, and anybody outside of that zone is in trouble.
Yeah, definitely. Another skill you might want to consider, particularly with outdoor traps where there's a bear trap or a hunter's trap or a pit or something like a snare, is using your nature skill. Now, some dungeon masters, if you say, look, since I'm a ranger and I am proficient or trained in nature, am I able to figure out how this trap works? Because a lot of those traps are fairly simple. They may require a dice roll, or they might not require a dice roll to figure out how it works, to figure out how it's all constructed. But I would certainly consider using nature, particularly if you've got a pretty good skill or stat modifier for that. If it's good, then use it. And don't always expect your dungeon master to specify a dice roll. If you are very specific about how you're looking for it and examining it, they may decide that you being proficient is sufficient, and that's it.
That makes sense. It seems like rangers would be really good for the outdoors. When you mentioned that, I immediately thought of bear traps, pit traps that are covered with foliage or leaves or things of that nature, and then that net trap that you step in and then it goes cinches you up and sends you up in the tree. Those are all things. If I were playing a ranger, I would probably want to communicate somehow to my DM that I'm on the lookout for those kind of environmental hazards, if you will, especially if that's my favorite terrain. I would think that I would be really good at finding those types of things.
If I haven't already mentioned it, when it comes to examining the trap and trying to figure out how it works, make sure the rest of the party are standing a good distance from you, because the process of examining and trying to figure out that trap might actually set it off. And so it's better that one individual winds up getting crispy rather than everybody get crispy. So it's one of the most common things you need to do. It's fairly obvious. Most people understand that one.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to protect the cleric and anyone with healing, because they're going to need to bring you back.
So when you're evaluating your traps, there are so many types. There's a bunch of them, and they can be quite complicated, or combinations. So the types of things you're looking for is your collapsing roof. Usually a collapsing roof is either designed to block you off and trap you, or to crush you and kill you. And then you've got your falling net, which is usually just designed to capture you and nothing else. The fire-breathing statue, which can also breathe cold or some other thing, or acid. Those are another type of trap you've got to be careful of. It's quite a common trap to come across. The pit trap, absolutely the most common type of trap. They're not always designed to kill you. Some will have spikes in them with poison on them, and of course the idea is that it's going to hurt you really badly. But some pit traps are just designed to capture you, and that's it.
I have one idea on that before you continue, Fred. So as far as pit traps, and I forget where I read this. This isn't my idea, but someone said that after you trigger a pit trap, to maybe go down there and explore it a little bit. Perhaps there's like a secret door or something, and the trap was just to bring you down. So after that pit trap is triggered, instead of just walking on, continue on, maybe send a scout down there, send your familiar down, see if there's a secret door or something. There might not have been, but since you did that, your DM might put something cool down there.
Now, the poison dart trap, usually pretty easy to spot because it's usually indicated by holes in a wall or a floor or a ceiling, but the wall is the most common one. And they are usually designed to either kill a character or slow them down or set them up for some other monster by imparting the poison condition. But they're pretty easy to find and evaluate how they work. What you don't want to do is get foolish and stick your eye in line with the hole, okay? That's why you brought along your mirror. You've got a piece of equipment called a steel mirror. You use your mirror in front of the hole. Don't stick your head in front of the hole when you're examining those sorts of things. Then you've got your poison needle. Now, the poison needle is usually just a needle that shoots up, and it's usually sitting over the top of something. When you open it up or your hand's in the right place, the needle hits you and you get poisoned. They have many different reasons why they're there, and they usually have different effects as well. Then you've got your rolling boulder or sphere. This is your Indiana Jones or Raiders of the Lost Ark first scene. Try not to get squashed.
Right.
Probably one of the worst types of traps you can deal with, because usually they kill characters. Unless, of course, your dungeon master is very nice and decides you're able to squeeze between whatever small area might exist in the passageway, if there is one at all. The sphere of annihilation. Now, it's quite a common one. It's the worst one under the sun. It usually doesn't kill characters. You usually lose a limb. But don't stick your hands into things. And the Tomb of Horrors, there is this devil face, and its mouth is open. And it's waiting for somebody foolish enough to put a hand or a head. Don't ever put your head into any kind of hole, because it could be a sphere of annihilation, no more head, and you are dead. Whereas put your hand in there or a finger, and it's only the hand or finger gone. Now, there are lots of traps that are magical, and magical traps that have magical effects can range. And there's so many different types. They can be evocation and explode, causing lightning, fire, all sorts of different things. But they can do other things that you weren't expecting. And I can't give you a full array of how to deal with them. And how to figure out if that's what is going on here. Usually, spell effects are almost impossible to detect or figure out without using your familiar and identify. And of course, sometimes you might have a dungeon master who decides to have more than one spell effect in place, which is quite horrible, because you're probably only going to pick up the first one. The Glyph of Warding is another spell that dungeon masters like to use, and you can either touch the glyph, you can move close enough to activate it, you can remove something from the Glyph of Warding, and that can activate it. There's so many different ways this can be used. It's a very nasty type of trap. And so I can't give you a solution for all of them. All I would suggest is try to be as far away from it if it's there. And if you do get caught in the Glyph of Warding, hopefully you have a cleric who's around to deal with the consequences of you either dying or suffering a lot of injuries.
Absolutely.
We get into the more mundane traps. These are much easier to find. Something like a bear trap or a hunting trap are usually pretty easy to spot and figure out how they work. They're very simple. They're usually mechanical. There's something like the crossbow trap. Again, a fairly simple one to find, and they are often placed out in the open and are really obvious. So like a statue will be holding a crossbow and it's loaded. And all you have to do is look at it and think, well, no, that's probably just part of the statue. It might not well be part of the statue. Anytime you see statues or something holding something, don't assume that it's made of wood or it's a carving or it's a stone fixture. It may in fact be a live weapon. So they're reasonably easy to figure out. The scything blades, in terms of how you figure out are you dealing with a scything blade, usually there is a gap, a very thin gap, either in the wall, the floor, or the ceiling, where that scything blade will sweep through. And that's a good indication, if you see something like that, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a blade that swings along a set path. The fiery blast, usually they look very similar to your poison dart trap. They're usually just a hole in the wall, but they can be holes in the eyes of statues and other things. So pay attention to any kind of thing that has a hole, because that usually indicates there's something that can shoot out of that, and fire is one of the most common things to use. The falling portcullis. Now, the falling portcullis is not usually a big deal in terms of the fact that the portcullis falls. It's not usually directed at falling on top of you. It's usually directed at falling behind you to trap you, and then something else much worse is going to come at you, whether it be a monster or another part of the trap. But it's usually designed to trap you rather than kill you.
Makes sense.
And they're really easy to find and see, because there's going to be a space above you somewhere that indicates where it is, or your dungeon master will put it out in the open, and it will be a portcullis to a castle, and it'll be set up to drop as soon as somebody moves past it, or a set number of individuals move past it. Now remember, traps aren't always automatic. Sometimes they are controlled by other creatures. And if they see you moving past a location, they drop that portcullis, they trap you, and then they attack you.
I can see that as a tactic used by goblins or some other monsters to split a party. As they see two of the party members go through, they drop the portcullis, and then they have them divided, or they can ambush one side while the other watches. So that's a really cool idea.
Okay, so the last trap I want to talk about, and that is the Sleep of Ages. I have no solution for you on that one. Okay, usually the Sleep of Ages isn't designed to kill you. It's just designed to put you to sleep. And then it means, provided there's somebody who's not asleep, you can hopefully find some way of bringing them back to consciousness. But avoiding something like that is really difficult, like most magical traps. The best thing you can do is hopefully you detect basically where it is. Trying to figure out how it works is always the hardest one.
So would you advise maybe always traveling with an elf? Because I don't think anything can put them to sleep. Just make sure our elf friend is always there to wake us up if we need it.
Well, it means that having an elf in the party is a really good idea, because they can't be put to sleep magically, can they? So there'll at least be somebody up who can deal with everybody else who's currently having a snooze or dozing.
Absolutely. Making that elf a cleric would be even better.
So if you're looking for information on traps and evaluating how they work and the types of traps there are, a good place to look is the Dungeon Master's Guide from pages 120 to 123, and also Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Now, you're looking for pages 113 right through to 123, because it goes into simple traps and complex traps. And that's the sort of information you might find really useful, so that you can prepare yourself for the future.
I like that. So yeah, definitely some great resources. And there's nothing wrong as a player to look through the DMG or look in the Dungeon Master's section of a book like Xanathar's. It's always good to have knowledge, of course, you know, portray that through your character as you will with regards to metagaming or not metagaming, but some fantastic ideas. That's for sure. I'm like learning so much from this series as a player, but I think I'm learning even more as a Dungeon Master, and that just scares me a lot.
So I would say there's just one other thing I want you to consider when you're evaluating the trap before you do anything else, trying to figure out what it is. And that is, you need to decide what sort of risk factor is there, okay? What's the lowest risk factor for dealing with the trap when you evaluate it? What method are you going to use, okay? And that means we're moving to the next step. When you evaluate it, you need to decide, is disarming the trap, avoiding the trap, triggering the trap, jamming the trap, or doing something else the best option given the nature of that particular trap? Because not all traps try to kill you. Some traps try to do things that just set you back or trap you.
And it seems to me that, especially with this entire series so far and everything that you've highlighted today, that if I can get out of doing all of that and avoiding the trap, that is the route that my character is going to take. And so speaking of avoiding and disarming traps, that's going to be part 3 in our series, Player's Survival Guide to Traps. So make sure that you take a look for that and watch for when it releases. Or if you're watching this in the future, then it is already available, and make sure you skip ahead and watch it now. So once again, Fred, thank you very much for coming on the show. You have provided a ton of information to help players, and I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome, and I look forward to talking about how to deal with those traps and disarm them.
Fantastic. So for those of you not familiar, Fred has a YouTube channel, How to D&D. He has thousands of videos for players and dungeon masters, and even hundreds of videos probably on traps and all kinds of different uses for your mundane items, your 10-foot poles, your rocks, your things of that nature. So make sure you go check them out. I'll put a link in the description below. So we will see you in part 3. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much for watching, and on to the next.
You're right.
Yeah, the Spear of Annihilation. I just that one just gets me every time. How somebody just boop, it's gone.